The race for Supply Chain 2020 is on. Today, 9 out of 10 companies are stuck. They are unable to balance trade-offs. There are 7 hurdles to overcome. Number 1, companies are treating the supply chain like a function, rather than an end-to-end process that can eliminate waste, reduce cost, and improve value. Number 2, we hired a busload of consultants and spent buckets of money on best practices. But these were not best practices after all. Rather, they were emerging practices. Number 3, our technologies are about us, not our customers. Customer data is more readily available, but current technologies aren't taking advantage of it. Number 4, our progress is like a snail in a fast-paced world. The metronome of the supply chain is speeding up. Are you ready for real time? Number 5, we are simply not prepared to compete for talent. Sure, this guy looks good, but does he know supply chain? Talent is the missing link. Number 6, current technologies are becoming legacy. New technologies are emerging, but the outcomes are unknown. Are you ready to focus on small, iterative projects with an unknown ROI? Number 7, our supply chains are reactive. Are you ready for systems that sense and learn? We must move past yesterday. Our brains need to be rewired for new mental models. Now, imagine adopting new technologies, and realigning processes and people. The race for Supply Chain 2020 is on. Now is the time for an end-to-end focus, new leadership, active listening, keeping pace, building talent, taking risks, rethinking supply chain excellence, and rewiring for new mental models. Are you ready?
I don't think many of us are ready. In fact, I think most of us are like the man on the moving sidewalk in front of us. We've had processes and technologies that are moving us forward. But like being on that moving sidewalk, whether we're in an airport somewhere or we've got a destination, we need to know where we're going. And one of the things that I want to challenge you is that most supply chain leaders today are stuck. They're not able to make progress like they think they are on operating margin, on improving cycles, on driving productivity, and really driving growth. And the reason why I wanted to put this program together was for us to really have a call to action to imagine, not our supply chains as we know them today, but the supply chains as they could be, the supply chains of the future. So my name is Lora Cecere, and I founded Supply Chain Insights with this goal in mind. And it started at my kitchen table and the writing of the book Bricks Matter. 2012 was the 30th anniversary of supply chain management, and I thought there needed to be a litmus test, a way for us to really take stock of what have we done as supply chain leaders. And so I wrote the book. I included 65 case studies. And what I found was that we learned more from failure than success. Now, can you imagine being an author and trying to get permission from a company to publish a failure? But actually, we stumbled forward in the last 30 years. And one of my challenges to you today is, let's put our shoulders back and let's have clearer purpose on where we're going. Now, it was hard to get this book published because The publishers said no one will read a book about supply chain management. It's so boring. And in fact, I think we've made supply chain management boring. Our yada yada language, our acronyms, we talk geek speak, right? My second challenge to you is to be able to talk the language of business. And so as people leave my conference, I want them to really assess how well have we as supply chain leaders put our shoulder to the wheel to really drive corporate performance, because I believe supply chain matters. I believe it saves the world. I believe supply chain is at the heart of all businesses, and I know you do too, and that's why you're here. Now, as we talk, I have a friend over here who will be drawing the story, and we will capture this for everyone that's here so that you can go back and you can help your teams imagine through our visual facilitator. I also have asked companies to come and talk about their stories and to share their stories of supply chain excellence. Because I believe bricks matter. I believe that we need to redefine supply chain excellence, that we need to really think about how we drive corporate performance on what I call the effective frontier, and that we need to tie ourselves to performance on balance sheets and income statements and hold ourselves accountable. But when we do that, we find that we're stuck. The supply chain technologies and processes of 30 years are largely legacy. And as we move forward, we have to learn what we did in the last 30 years, to unlearn, to relearn, to free ourselves to think about this differently. So when I sat at my kitchen table and I first started to write the book Bricks Matter, I believed that we had improved operating margin, that we had improved customer service, and we had improved inventory turns. When I finished the book 9 months later, I found that most companies are stalled. Let me tell you their story. It starts with a sign like this: supply chain. I was one of those supply chain pioneers that fought to have a function. And that function has become a barrier to supply chain progress. Because when I talk about end-to-end supply chain, from the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier, most companies say the supply chain organization doesn't have that ability, that permission. How do we get past this role of a function where we've defined it very narrowly as distribution and logistics and order management and maybe procurement, to really be able to look end to end? Our research says that 3% of companies have someone that's responsible for end to end. But to get yourself unstuck, to really be clear on the vision of where you're going, it can't be inside out like the traditional supply chain. No, it's not an evolution. I challenge you that it's a revolution to be able to go outside in. And we built supply chains that are inherently late. They capture orders, they capture shipments, they work on late data. And one of the things I'm going to ask you to think about is, what if the data has no latency? What if the data is real time? What if we have in memory so that we no longer have to plan in silos? What if we could redefine visibility with new forms of visualization? What if we had systems that could test and learn? I don't think it's about putting old systems like advanced planning onto faster models. I think it requires the redefinition of what we're doing. The second barrier that we find over and over again is the understanding of the executive team of this thing called supply chain. And you know, our yada yada talk has put many of them to sleep, right? And the supply chain is a complex system with increasing complexity. And what I find is most people are not aware of this complex system nature, where we have to make trade-offs, and it's about improving the potential of the supply chain. And most companies have not embraced improving the potential, and I'll show you the results. The second thing that we see over and over again is the ability to get data. We spend on average 1.7% of revenue on technology. But over and over again, when I talk to clients, they can't get to data. They can't use data. They're not able to visualize the incentives. Only 23% of companies in our research can actually get to profitability analysis. And only 11% of companies are able to do what-if analysis well. We put in tightly integrated and flexible systems, and we've gotten an output that really doesn't drive the corporate performance that we need. So as we think about embracing the supply chain as a complex system, we need to imagine new processes outside in. The other point is every supply chain strategy that I read has this term agility. It's kind of a buzzword these days, yeah? But when I challenge people to say, what does agility mean to you? They look at me like I'm the dumbest woman ever, right? Because we don't define it, and we don't build systems for it. We've built strong supply chains that are inflexible, but we haven't built supply chains that can adapt, that can test and learn, that can sense. Our supply chains are like the Pavlov dog image that we had in our opening. They respond, they don't sense. There's no place to put customer data. And so as we think about agility, I think we've got to think about how do we have supply chains that are able to give the same cost, quality, and customer service given the level of demand and supply volatility. Let me tell you a story. About the time I was writing Bricks Matter, the doctor said to me, you know, Laura, you really have to get in better shape. And I started and I hired a trainer. And as I trained, I lifted weights and tried to get stronger. I found that I was very inflexible, right? The more I lifted, the more inflexible I got. And so my 60-year-old body, I felt like, is a lot like many of your supply chains, right? And so we not only have to, in proving potential, improve strength, but we have to build flexibility, right? I had to go back to yoga and ballet to get more flexible. I had to work on it. Your supply chains have got to be designed for agility. Pilots in aircraft train in simulators. They don't train for what is going to happen. They train their minds to be able to simulate and predict and to be able to work when something happened. It's not the specific thing that they train for, it's a mental mindset. So as we think about agility, I think we've got to think about how do we build it in our supply chains? How do we reward it? And how do we drive it? The other issue is most companies have a hole in the middle. They believed that they implemented best practices. They believed that they opened this magic box of software and they got best practices. And nothing could be further from the truth. And they believed that they hired supply chain strategists that came in and gave them wonderful business strategy. But what I'm going to tell you is that I think that there's a missing hole in the middle called supply chain strategy. Yes, we have a business strategy. We know what needs to happen for the business. But we know what needs to happen at a value chain strategy level, the right things we need to do to make the trade-offs. And if we're going to start outside in, we have to start on the ends of the supply chain, not the center. And it's the ends of the supply chain that are weak. As we think about the design of demand networks and the use of channel data, you know, point-of-sale data in consumer packaged goods was designed in 1980s. Companies still can't use it, and the data has become increasingly available. And the ability to have new forms of analytics for social data, for point-of-sale data, for loyalty data is increasing. But people still ask me, what's the ROI? I'm like, you're asking the wrong question, right? It's the design of the demand network. It's about building the right relationships. And the supply network. One of the reasons why I asked Intel to come today is their work on supply sensing and supplier development and the ability to test and sense on either end of the value network. And in the center is the design of that supply chain response, to be sure that it's not only strong, but it's agile. And as we talk about corporate performance, we've increased complexity in product portfolios, but we've not changed the design of the supply chain to embrace this changing complexity. And this missing gap for talent, we're going to talk about today. A 9-to-1 ratio, demand and supply for new talent. But the big issue is in mid-management talent. How do we grow people that understand supply chains as a system that can imagine the supply chain of the future? So I don't believe we had best practices. I don't see it in the numbers, and I'll show you the numbers in a minute. I think we evolved like this. The really early pioneers believed that the most effective supply chain was the most efficient supply chain. But one of the things that I've learned is it's not the most efficient supply chain that's the most effective, because cost and procure to pay does not give us the ability to trade off and deliver customer service and to deliver our brand promise. So about 10 years ago, the definition became the right product at the right place at the right time at the right cost. And this is about the time that we evolved the concept of the integrated supply chain. But our supply chains weren't resilient, and I'll show you some evidence of that. And in fact, in chemical and high tech and pharmaceutical, it is really a tough world to be able to balance these trade-offs. They're just not resilient. So we haven't built the ability to have buffers and the design of agility to absorb demand volatility and supply volatility. And I have written for 6 years around the concepts of becoming demand-driven, which are sensing demand, shaping demand, and translating demand. We're still very early. We've had a lot more talk than we've had a lot of action. In fact, we have a lot of consultants that believe they know what it is, but when I talk to them about the value of reducing demand latency and what it means to actually sense demand, they're not clear. So tomorrow, my very best student in demand-driven, Rick Sather from Kimberly-Clark, will tell you a story. You know, it's a story when I first started talking to Rick, and Kimberly-Clark runs big machines, and they came from a lean background. And I talked about the need to use channel data and to design the supply chain outside in and to move the supply chain past cost to deliver value. And he'll tell you his story. But he won't tell you how much he added to the top line because he can't. But I don't believe demand-driven is sufficient. I think instead we need to go one step further as we imagine. We need to move outside in. We need to build strong horizontal processes of revenue management, corporate social responsibility, sales and operations planning, supplier development, and build T-shaped leaders that balance breadth and depth. And we need to embrace new forms of analytics that allow us to continually test and learn in market, in vitro, cognitive learning engines, the combination of reasoning with optimization, the ability to sense off of channel data and to orchestrate end to end. And it's new forms of analytics. And it comes from new best-of-breed providers, and it requires us to have courage to take projects that have unknown ROIs. And as we look at the orchestration of demand and supply, it has to be about the connection to a strategy, a supply chain strategy, where supply chain excellence is defined by year-over-year performance against a peer group. We can't just put all supply chains in a spreadsheet and shake them up and declare a winner. We've got to align internally on metrics, and it has to be connected to the business strategy, and it requires innovation. And I'm going to tell you the story of supply chain leaders as they've conquered the effective frontier. So I've defined supply chain excellence as the ability to drive year-over-year performance, to get this balance, not to look at singular metrics, but to really look at trade-offs. And I'm going to talk about how well companies have done on balancing these trade-offs. And 9 out of 10 companies are stuck. And we are the people and the leadership that can move them forward. And I'm also going to talk about the concept of the supply chain index, which is a formulaic representation and a correlation to market capitalization, because I believe supply chains matter. This is my representation of the effective frontier of trade-offs. Every supply chain we manage is a complex system. Our supply chain strategies say that we want to drive growth. Growth is harder these days. Industries are stalling. year-over-year growth is tougher. Companies want to drive profitability, but most companies are struggling. Companies want to improve cash-to-cash cycles, inventory cycles, but the best performance at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns actually happens after a recession, not during the good times. It's when we really get focused against some kind of a critical business reason we're able to drive forward. Instead, what's happened in most companies is an increase in complexity. Product portfolios have increased, markets have increased. We've not really rationalized our ability to have the potential and the supply chain to balance this effective frontier. We have to build it. Most supply chains are inherited, they're not designed. So in the writing of the book Supply Chain and Bricks Matter, and my new book, which will be called Metrics That Matter, I built a database of 20 years of financial ratios. I wanted to look at financial ratios on the effective frontier to compare big companies against little companies. And I wanted to look at it over 2 decades of growth and to start to do correlations to market capitalization. And I found the most interesting trends at these 3 intersections. And we've been mining this data for over a year, and many of you have your benchmarking results with you. The most interesting patterns happen at cash to cash versus inventory turns. What's happened is most companies have increased payables, but they've not made a lot of progress on inventory turns themselves. And revenue per employee versus inventory turns, what you're going to see is some leaders have been able to improve productivity and improve revenue turns, but they're struggling on improving inventory turns. But the most pressing issue is at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns, because it's where companies are really struggling. And what I find is each individual industry has a unique pattern of trade-offs, but we've not done a good job of balancing it. And it's about much more than return on assets, days of inventory, and growth. So let's look at our results. Let's hold ourselves accountable. Over the last decade, this is what we've done in productivity. The chemical companies have outperformed in productivity, but they've not been able to manage operating margin and inventory turns very well. Consumer packaged goods companies have had resiliency. They have had the second best results in productivity. And then we move downward. And it's the companies that were not able to get global scale, had to increase the account teams as power shifted in the supply chain, that weren't able to move forward. And if we look at retail, again, very, very flat progress on productivity. Now, when we look at the intersection of operating margin and inventory, you can see that a few companies, about 33%, have been able to make progress at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns. In fact, we have 3 companies in the house today that made year-over-year progress. Dow Chemical, General Mills, and, Colgate. But look at that 3rd consecutive year. Look at the fall off. This is where I say now 9 out of 10 companies are stuck. They're unable to make the 3rd year of consecutive progress on driving this important intersection. And look at the fall off on the 4th year. Many people think we're making progress. We're not. But look what happens at the impact of a recession. When there's a recession, the year following on the balance sheet, you tend to see progress. It's in the good years that we tend to not see progress. But I find the best stories in the patterns, because in the writing of the book, I heard the pioneers say time after time, progress doesn't happen overnight. It isn't about what happened next year. It takes at least 3 years. It takes at least 5 years. So what I've been doing is I've been looking at the patterns at the intersection of these points. And the way to look at this is we show you the company name and the averages against the intersection. And I want to tell you the stories. So let's look at beverage. PepsiCo versus Coca-Cola. 2 very comparable peer group companies. I would never rate Coca-Cola above PepsiCo. PepsiCo has a very tight pattern, and they have been able to make slower improvement on revenue per employee, but they're resilient. Look at Coca-Cola going backwards, right? Yes, they made a lot of choices around distributors, but they're going backwards, and most people don't realize it. Let's look at cereal. General Mills versus Kellogg, two peer group companies. If we look at revenue per employee, this particular peer group has really struggled with productivity. They are trying to go global, and they've had to add staff to be able to compete in retail. But look at General Mills able to drive operating margin, and Kellogg is not, right? It's about supply chain excellence. It's about use of analytics. It's about supply chain leadership. It's about the things that matter. Tim Wiedenhoff wears a tag. He made it. He made progress at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns. Household products. Let's look at Unilever and Colgate and Procter Gamble. Look at the lack of resiliency at Unilever. Unilever made big swings on payables. And if I take Unilever away and I just look at Procter & Gamble and Colgate, one of the reasons why I built the supply chain index is it's hard for me to see who's making the most progress. These two companies are making different trade-offs on the effective frontier. Both of them are making year-over-year improvements. Colgate is outperforming every company that I've studied on operating margin. Procter & Gamble is outperforming on revenue per employee and inventory turns. And so as we look at these patterns, it's a very tight pattern. And you can see here Procter & Gamble's improvement on inventory turns. Now there are lots of technology vendors that may claim that they made this happen. But it was a combination of focus and technologies and the ability to commit to do this year over year. And Lisa is going to talk about the Procter & Gamble story. So we have to look year over year. We have to look at how companies made trade-offs. We have to look at it against averages. And this is a comparison against the industry average and the evolution of this particular sector. It became harder in this sector to drive operating margin. It became harder to be able to drive growth. Colgate was successful in driving operating margin and growth, less successful in inventory. Procter & Gamble was more successful in driving revenue per employee. Now, as you look at these patterns and you look at your benchmarking, you're going to find that most of the data in your packets doesn't show this level of resiliency. In fact, most companies that are attending will actually show very wild swings on their performance because supply chain leaders have very tight patterns of resiliency year after year. So I wanted to take this one step further, and I wanted to start to say supply chain matters. I think it matters to the balance sheet. And could I correlate supply chain financial ratios to market capitalization? And I designed a term called the supply chain index, which was to be an equation based upon linear regression against market capitalization. And we took 6 years of market cap data, and we took the ratios and we started working in linear regression, and we built formulas. And this is the household products formula. And this would be the application of the household products formula to the performance. And you can see here that Procter & Gamble has a much more balanced set of metrics, and days of inventory actually has more correlation. And then we started looking at all of the industries and the metrics that matter, and which metrics matter in which industries. And interestingly, when you look at the correlation, so we looked at the partitioning exercises and the clustering exercises to see where we could get patterns, the days of inventory, the days of payables have very tight patterns. It's not return on assets, it's return on invested capital. And it's about operating margin. It's about all the things we're stuck on, right? So then we said, could the equations that we built predict the future? So we took off 2012 and we tried to use the data of the 5 years to predict 2012. And what we found was we need to do more work. The companies below the line, the sectors below the line, are getting pretty good mean absolute percent values. The companies above the line need work. So over the next year, we're going to continue the work on these formulas to be able to look at how we have predictive models. But I gotta say, after doing 12 months of research, the things that we should care about, we're moving the slowest on. And the way to get there is not the old processes and technologies. I think instead we need to imagine. We need to imagine a future that we don't see today. I think that we need to think about big data in a very different way and new forms of analytics. And it isn't the questions we know to ask, it's the answers to the questions that we don't know to ask. And we need to think about digital manufacturing, the Internet of Things, the pumps and motors and belts in our factories that are sending off signals and the patterns associated with them, and the sensors on trucks, and the ability to move cold chains, and the ability to change transportation. I was at a seminar the other day that said that if we had manless vehicles and if we had robotics in the warehouse, that we could reduce logistics costs by 40%. I'm like, bring it on. And as we think about digital path to purchase, the automation of the moments of truth in the cycle, or the collaborative economy that my friend Jeremiah Owang is going to talk about in the use of social signals, or 3D printing, or using corporate social responsibility as a brand advantage, or the evolution of business networks with inter-enterprise system of record. I think we're facing a brand new world. I think we're facing a world where we can imagine the world not as we see it today, but what it could be. And so when I ask you to tell me about the trends that you're excited about, you're excited about big data. I'm not sure you're excited about big data for the reasons that I'm excited about big data, because I think that it isn't just the velocity of data or the volume of data. What I love about big data is the variety of data, the ability to use structured and unstructured text, the ability to really power new forms of analytics. What I also love is the way that we can visualize and we can see visibility in the supply chain in ways that we've never been able to see before. And also, as we go down the stack, I'm starting to see people think about the Internet of Things, machines that talk to us and sensors, and I'm starting to see people start to think about unstructured data. I'm like, bring it on. I love the idea of a supply chain that can sense. Let me tell you a story. So in the audience is a company by the name of Logitech, and they make a product that goes in the ear, and every earpiece is custom made. And it was really tough for Logitech. In fact, nobody liked this product because it was a custom-made earpiece. Now, this earpiece sold for $450, much more than the conventional earpiece, but the supply chain could not adapt to have this level of customization. And there was a leader, and he said, let's try 3D printing. Let's print in region every unique earpiece. And he was able to break the cycle of complexity and inventory and operating margin. So as we think about the effective frontier and we think about supply chain, we can't think about business as usual. We can't think about yelling our message and hoping that people buy our product. We've got to learn to listen through sentiment analysis and use of customer data. We've got to build talent. It doesn't just happen, and it's not about the functional leadership of yesterday. So in conclusion, I believe companies are stuck. We've been at this for 30 years, but it's time for us to ask ourselves hard questions. And new practices are emerging, and no, they're not all going to be successful, but I think that we're going to see the evolution of new business models, new leadership that will redefine supply chain, not just as a cost center, but to deliver value. But as we do this, and as we try to fill in the gap, of the person and the supply chain leader that's traveling this path. We must design with the end in mind, because the end that we're painting today is not able to get us there. So I'll be writing about this in my book that will come out next April on Metrics That Matter. We'll continue the work on correlations, and we'll continue to do the work around supply chain leadership. I want to thank the sponsors that have sponsored this event. Please spend time with them. Most of them are emerging vendors, and you don't see the big vendors on this list, right? I believe that the new forms of technologies will come from best-of-breed providers, will come from cloud providers, will come from entrepreneurs who are asking a question about, can we do this differently? We want to continue the discussion, and everything that we're doing is open. The painting that's being done over here will be shared. The Ustream will be shared. The slides will be shared. We want to elevate the discussion. We feel we'll be successful if our research is used to help you to elevate the discussion. And we'll continue this next year. In 2014, we'll gather in the same place, and we'll continue the dialogue. So as we think about this, enjoy the conference. There are wonderful people in the audience. Network. And continue the learning. So with this, I'd like to introduce Lisa Sauer. Lisa is joining us from Procter Gamble. And I've asked Lisa to talk about the Procter Gamble journey of how is on this moving sidewalk, and the processes and technologies are moving fast, causing an acceleration of the traveler. But does the traveler know where he's going? And is there a good definition of supply chain effectiveness? What I want to do in this presentation is really help you to see how have different industries performed in the last decade. I'm going to sensitize you to a better understanding of resilience and what balance means on the effective frontier. I'm going to talk about how household products, chemical, pharmaceutical, high-tech, and retail have actually done in performance. So let's get started. Now this morning, just to be sure that we're all aligned, we talked about what defines supply chain excellence. Yeah, a lot of people will say supply chain excellence in their strategy documents, and when I ask them, what does supply chain excellence mean? They'll also say, well, aren't you the dumbest person in the world that you don't know what that means? But what I want to sensitize you to is it's a complex subject. And the potential of the supply chain has really got to be aligned to allow companies to make the balanced trade-offs to improve performance. And it requires companies to do better than peer groups. So I don't believe that you can put all companies in a spreadsheet and shake them up. I think that you've got to compare companies against peer group. And you've got to really look at year-over-year results. And there has to be clear alignment on internal metrics to really drive that supply chain strategy. Because as we talked this morning, it isn't about best practices, it's really about the alignment for trade-off to maximize the potential of the supply chain. The other thing is, these leaders are often innovators in driving processes, and they show balance. So let's take a look at how have different companies performed on the effective frontier. How have they managed growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity? So what I'm going to do is talk about the pattern over the last decade that allows you to really contrast cash to cash and inventory turns, and to be able to look at revenue per employee versus inventory turns, and inventory turns versus operating margin. Three very different views, but it's only when you look at these different views that you can get some true appreciation of supply chain excellence. Now this morning I talked about Colgate-Palmolive versus Procter Gamble, and I said, you know, it's really a toss-up which of two of those companies have performed best. Both of them have been supply chain leaders. Here what I want to do is take a similar view, but I want to contrast Procter Gamble versus Unilever. Now when we look at Procter Gamble versus Unilever, Procter Gamble is a much larger company, but Unilever and Procter Gamble have both competed in the global supply chain contest. But look at the difference in the pattern. Procter & Gamble much tighter pattern, much better definition in the last 3 years on improvement of inventory turns. Unilever, a much bigger swing. And so as you look at the evolution and the improvement of inventory turns at about the time of the Great Recession, and then the very large swing back and forth, that's an example of a supply chain that is not as resilient. We don't see the consistency in the pattern and the year-over-year performance. Now, revenue per employee, both companies made progress, but look at how Procter & Gamble outpaced the Unilever performance. Procter & Gamble is clearly the revenue per employee leader in this particular category. And then when we look at operating margin versus inventory turns, which is the tougher metric, if companies are able to make it on the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns, they've made it. In fact, we talked this morning how 3 companies in the audience have actually made year-over-year improvement. Of all the people that are at the conference, only Dow Chemical, Colgate, and also General Mills have made progress on this important metric. But look again at the swing that we see here of Unilever versus Procter & Gamble. While Procter & Gamble in the last couple of years has gone backwards in operating margin, it is much more resilient. And then, of course, we need to not only look at the pattern, but we need to look at the averages, because when we can put this all together, we can assess how well companies have made trade-offs and actually balance the metrics on the effective frontier. It's complex, but as you do this, you get a much better appreciation of how companies performed. So here we have green as the household products average, orange is Procter & Gamble, and black is Unilever. You can see that both Unilever and Procter & Gamble did much better on inventory turns. And as you look at cash-to-cash cycles, Unilever made great steps on really shortening cash-to-cash cycles. However, they lost resiliency as they made payables very large. On revenue per employee, both of the companies outperformed. And when we look at operating margin, Procter & Gamble has outperformed the industry peer group to a greater degree. So the advantage of this kind of approach is I can compare big companies to little companies. I can also look at companies across peer groups. So while Procter & Gamble is 21% larger in revenue, you can see that they're 48% better in revenue per employee, and sector operating margin has actually decreased. Now let's look at chemical. The chemical industry is further back in the supply chain. While they have done many things well, what we're going to see as we look at Ashland Chemical and Dupont, and again, Ashland is a much smaller company than Dupont, we're going to see that we've got a very big pattern here for Ashland. And not only is it a large pattern, Ashland is actually moving backwards on the inventory turns. And Dupont, while that pattern is much smaller, is also moving backwards. This is very characteristic of the industry. We have wider swings and we have backward momentum, not forward momentum. Again, if we look at inventory turns versus revenue per employee, you don't have that nice, neat little pattern that you see with household products. It's a much wider swing, and the degree of improvement in productivity is not as high. Now, when we look at operating margin versus inventory turns, again, this is the tougher metric. Again, we see a real lack of resiliency, and we see this in most chemical companies. You do not see that tight pattern that you'll see in supply chain excellence. Again, as we look at the averages, with the black being the chemical average, and then orange being Dupont, and purple being Ashland, Dupont actually has an opportunity on the management of cash-to-cash and also the management of inventory turns. Both of those have been opportunities for Dupont over the last decade. And so we also see that both companies have outperformed the sector on inventory metrics, on operating margin, but they're not able to achieve balance. So as we think about chemical companies, they've done a lot of things right in terms of transactional efficiency, in terms of globalization, but they have not built the resilient supply chains that we see in household products. Pharmaceutical companies have an even bigger issue with resiliency. When we look at two companies, and here we're going to contrast Bristol-Myers Squibb and Merck, what we see is that Merck is bigger than Bristol-Myers Squibb, but Bristol-Myers Squibb has actually outperformed all of their competitors in the ability to balance in the effective frontier. Look at the pattern, because again we see a lack of resiliency in pharmaceutical, but look at the fact that Bristol-Myers Squibb has actually made improvement on inventory turns versus cash to cash, whereas we do not see the same results for Merck. A little later in the program, Philippe Lambotte, who works at Merck, will actually tell us the story behind the Merck numbers. And it comes down to leadership and really working through mergers and acquisitions and being able to align the company through multiple stages of that merger and acquisition. Again, if we look at revenue per employee versus inventory turns, and revenue per employee over the last decade was the easiest metric for supply chain leaders to actually drive forward. And you can see that Bristol-Myers Squibb outperformed Merck, and they actually outperformed the industry sector, and they were able to make progress at this intersection of both inventory turns and revenue per employee. Whereas Merck had more swings and backward movement that happened with that merger and acquisition, and they are not able to have the same level of performance that Bristol-Myers was able to present. Now look at inventory turns versus operating margin. It looks like a mess, doesn't it? Again, it's exemplary of the lack of resiliency in that particular industry to drive year-over-year returns, and the lack of ability to really have balance and to drive the trade-offs. So if we look at the averages of these particular companies, you can see that Merck had an opportunity in cash to cash, and also both companies had an opportunity in inventory turns. And when we look at operating margin, they were able to outperform in operating margin. But again, we're lacking balance, but we see that Bristol-Myers Squibb outperformed. Bristol-Myers Squibb in pharmaceutical is the best that we've studied, and it's a tough industry with very wide swings. You do not see those tight patterns that you see in household products. Another tough industry is the high-tech and electronics industry. If we think about the last decade and the changes that happened in price and market and just the changes in product life cycle, as many products would actually change 2 to 3 times in terms of how fast that they went to market and changed. Western Digital versus Seagate are good examples, and they're in the data storage area. And you can see that Seagate is actually a better performer than Western Digital, but let's take an example of how well they performed on the effective frontier. Look at the swings. The swings are much larger than what you even see in pharmaceutical, and you can actually see that we're moving backwards in many cases. So if we look at Western Digital here in red, we're actually moving backwards in inventory turns. And while Seagate starts and it begins this path, it makes some progress for a couple of years and then turns back up. Seagate has a better average, but both of the companies lack resiliency. Now let's take an example where we look at inventory turns versus revenue per employee. Again, Western Digital is moving backwards on both of these elements, and Seagate is making progress on revenue per employee, but not making progress on inventory turns. Again, this is an example where a lot of companies think we're making a lot of progress on metrics that we aren't really. Now, inventory turns versus operating margin, that tougher intersection, again, we see a real lack of resiliency here. And, you know, when we look at the averages, we can see that these two companies do better than other companies in this particular sector, but it's a tough slog. And so the last decade for high-tech and electronic companies has been rough and turbulent. It's been to a greater degree than other industries, but we see that Seagate actually outperformed Western Digital. Now let's look at apparel retail. This morning we talked about that apparel, either manufacturing or retail, wasn't able to make the same progress on revenue per employee as some of the other companies in their surrounding sectors. But when we look at Inditex, which is a company that many will know better by Zara, and we look at Lululemon, which is a specialty company for athletic women's gear, you can see that a very small company is going to be compared with a very large company. And when we look at this, we see a much cleaner pattern. You know, this is a case of resiliency, and so you can see that Indentex actually is able to bring down those inventory turns with a tight pattern of year-over-year improvement. Lululemon, a small company that has emerged, is actually able to drive down inventory turns also and to make improvements. But again, it's not at the same level as Zara, but if we look at year-over-year improvements, a small company is able to compete with a supply chain leader, a well-recognized supply chain case study. And so when you look at the year-over-year improvements of Zara, look at Lululemon coming right in there as well. And it's a small company that is able to compete on a revenue per employee basis against a larger company. So again, when we look at inventory turns versus operating margin, which to me is one of the big litmus tests of supply chain excellence, you can see a clear pattern here. And you can see that Lululemon is actually able to outperform inventory turns and operating margin, but it's a much different story than what you saw in pharmaceutical and high tech, where you've got clear patterns and you've got the ability to have progress. So when we look at the averages and we look at Indentex versus Lululemon versus the average, black representing the average, Lululemon being red, and green Indentex, we can see that both companies are able to make improvements in operating margin and outperform. They're able to show improvement in revenue per employee, but there's actually an opportunity for them to do even better against the sector. When we look at year-over-year growth, there's also an opportunity for them to do better in the sector. And when we look at cash to cash, you can see that Lululemon has a larger cash to cash cycle, and Indentex or Zara has actually outperformed there. So we need to look at both the pattern and the averages to be able to make the assessment on supply chain excellence. And also, we've got to really think about the potential of the supply chain and the relative size of the company and the performance. So Lululemon, a small emerging company, was able to actually compete very well with a supply chain leader. Now let's think about mass merchants. It's a format in the last decade that really took shape in many of our global markets. And as we think about two companies that we know very well, Target and Walmart, you can see Walmart is, of course, a much bigger company than Target. But when we look at cash-to-cash improvements, Walmart being red and Target being purple, what we see is year-over-year improvements on inventory turns by Walmart, and Target is actually moving backwards on inventory turns. But again, the swings are not nearly as wide as what we see in pharmaceutical, high-tech, or chemical. Now, when we look at revenue per employee, Walmart, probably to no one's surprise, outperforms Target, and that both companies are able to make some progress in inventory turns, but Walmart is actually outperforming Target. Now again, this intersection of inventory turns versus operating margin, which is where we often will get into very messy patterns. Both of these companies are able to have very tight patterns. And look at the pattern of inventory turns going down for Walmart. And while there's not a lot of improvement in operating margin, it's a very tight pattern, whereas Target has a much wider pattern. And you see that, we're not able to maintain resiliency there. So as we look at these averages, you can see that the black, which represents all discount, and then purple and Target and red with Walmart, what we see is Walmart is outperforming in inventory turns, and they're also outperforming in cash to cash. They're also outperforming in operating margin, slightly under the industry average in terms of revenue per employee. But that particular pattern represents a supply chain leader. It's a conscious choice, and it's more balanced, whereas when we look at Target, Target is not performing as well in the cash to cash and inventory areas. So our interpretation, each industry has a different pattern. And so that's why it's really important that we compare people and companies within peer group. We need to understand how that particular pattern is coming about, the individual intersections on the effective frontier, and also the averages. Leaders make the trade-offs of the potential of the supply chain, and they make conscious trade-offs. Laggards let the supply chain pull them around and they react. So if we think back to our opening video this morning, where we actually talked about supply chains that could not respond, or supply chains that could not adapt, what we see here is the need to adapt and to really drive supply chain resiliency, to be able to make improvements on the effective frontier. So as you think about your journey on supply chain, what we're going to challenge you today is to imagine that you're on a different path. That instead of the traveler on the moving sidewalk that's using the supply chain practices that they've seen in the last 30 years, that you're able to think about supply chains differently. That you're able to think about year-over-year improvement, that you're able to think about the ability to move forward on balanced portfolios of supply chain metrics, really moving forward and thinking about supply chains differently. That you're able to think about them not inside out, but to really be able to move outside in. And that you're able to power a supply chain strategy because you realize that there aren't best practices, that there are emerging practices, and that we have to think about supply chains differently. So we started with household products, and household products have been a leader in the industry for many years. We contrasted Procter Gamble and Colgate earlier this morning, and we could argue who did that best, but you saw a very tight pattern of year-over-year improvement. And then we contrasted Procter Gamble and Unilever, and we saw that Procter Gamble outperformed over Unilever because Unilever had a much bigger pattern with less resiliency. And then we showed Ashland versus Dupont. And the chemical companies had less resiliency. They haven't really been able to power the effective frontier to the same level. And Dupont, who's an industry leader, actually went backwards, and Ashland had a lack of resiliency. And then we showed pharmaceutical companies, and the pharmaceutical companies have not been able to make the same progress on supply chain effectiveness as other industries, and we showed the very wide patterns and the turbulence in the pharmaceutical industries. And then we showed the high-tech industries, again, a pattern that lacks resiliency. And then we contrasted it with a couple of stories around apparel retail, where we saw Zara versus Lululemon, both companies able to make progress. And we showed Walmart versus Target, where Walmart was actually able to power supply chain improvements over Target. So as you sit and you think about it, supply chain matters. The companies that are able to do this the best are able to have resiliency in performance, and they're able to drive year-over-year improvements. When I was writing the book Bricks Matter, I had a couple of people tell me that supply chain effectiveness doesn't happen like this. It doesn't happen one year and then we change the next year, but it's the ability to make progress year over year, and many companies would say it takes at least 3 years or it takes 5 years, and we've got to be able to look at the long-term view. And we've got to be able to look at balance, and we've got to be able to hold ourselves accountable, because what got us here in the last 30 years is not the same thing that's going to help us to really move forward against these new goals and visions that we have. So as we think about this traveler, and we think about not what is the supply chain today, but what the supply chain can be, and we imagine what these supply chain performance results could be with big data as we are able to test and learn and we're able to adapt. And we think about how the supply chain can change with digital manufacturing, either the Internet of Things or 3D printing. Or we think about the supply chain and we think about building talent, or the use of corporate social responsibility as a brand, all of these things could come about to be not the supply chain as we know it, but the supply chain that can be. Because we, as travelers on this road of supply chain performance, are able to build the potential of the supply chain. And it's really supply chain excellence that is needed to really build that potential. Because, again, it comes about year-over-year performance. It's the ability to have supply chain strategy deliver business strategy. It's about the ability to really build that end-to-end process and to be able to deliver it year over year, end to end, and to be able to be resilient.